What would Sherlock Holmes be without Dr. John Watson? As Sherlock Holmes's friend and confidant, Watson provides a grounded perspective and support for the brilliant but sometimes unpredictable detective. How about Hermione Granger? She's part of a trio with Harry and Ron, and her intelligence, her talent for magic, and her loyalty make her not only a sidekick, but a standout character. How about Sancho Panza? You know, the one hanging out with Don Quixote, as written by Miguel de Cervantes. This loyal squire to the delusional Don Quixote brings humor and a little bit of common sense to the classic tale. We have other sidekicks in plenty of other films and books, such as imagine Donkey in Shrek. What would you do without Donkey to be all talkative and loyal? These sidekicks stand out for their unique qualities, their contributions to the narrative, and the impact they have on readers' and viewers' experiences. Welcome to the How to Be an Author podcast. We are going to be talking about sidekicks today. I think this is such an important question for writers seeking insight into the craft of writing. Sidekicks are super important. They are faithful. They bring depth and dynamics to your narrative. Introducing a sidekick can absolutely elevate your story. It provides support, conflict, and companionship for your main character. But it's not so easy to write a great sidekick. You want to give your sidekick unique qualities, motivations, and relationships that enhance rather than overshadow your protagonist. Because that's the thing. Your sidekick is a sidekick, not a main character, but you want them to resonate with readers. You want them to contribute meaningfully to your storytelling, but you also do not want them to steal the spotlight. So we're going to discuss strategies for writing a really effective sidekick. We're going to talk about what a sidekick is and isn't, and talk about how to prevent them from taking over the narrative. You want a balanced and focused storytelling experience, and we're going to be talking about that. And there is a time when less is more. So let's also talk in this podcast episode about the idea of maybe limiting the use of sidekicks. Now, as a writing coach, I have seen many young writers who love writing sidekicks. And we're going to be jumping into the psychology of why that might be, why younger, less experienced writers might be more into the idea of sidekicks that kind of take over. We're going to be talking also about why isolation can actually be a more powerful tool for character development. We're going to talk about embracing solitude in your characters, how that is going to deepen maybe your storyline, and it's going to foster some personal growth, some introspection, all of that good stuff. So whether you are a brand new aspiring writer, or you are a seasoned writer who's just looking to refine your writing craft a little bit so that you are kind of nudging those character dynamics, or you're, navigating that world of companionship and solitude, today's episode of the How to Be an Author podcast is going to be your guide to mastering that delicate balance. So let's talk about this today. Stay tuned. We are going to be jumping right in to the question of sidekicks so that we can elevate your storytelling in this short episode. If you're a writer dreaming of becoming a successful author, join me, writing coach Karena Akhavein, on the How to Be an Author podcast, your weekly source for writing information, inspiration, and motivation. Welcome to the How to Be an Author podcast. I am your host, writing coach Karena Akhavein, PhD, and I have been writing for years, and I've been helping authors like you for years to really help their writing craft, their writing mindset, and also kind of launch them into the idea that there is such a thing as the business of writing. And one of the main things when people talk about the difficulty of succeeding as a writer, one of the main things is, do you have a good story? Your story needs to be strong in terms of not only plot, but characters. And introducing a sidekick character may be exactly what your story needed. So let's talk about the purposes of a good sidekick first. First of all, in terms of character development, a good sidekick allows for exploring the main character's personality and motivations through not you telling, but through you showing their interactions with the sidekick. This is really great because it provides opportunities for characters to kind of bounce off of each other and undergo this growth and change that comes from the push and pull of a human relationship. Similarly, conflict and contrast are inherent in the discussion and the exposition of the differences between your main character and their sidekick. There is, in real life, a huge diversity in personalities, skills, values, etc. And when you have two characters who are close to each other and who contrast in these sorts of traits, this really highlights different perspectives and maybe strengthens certain aspects of your main character's personality. Now, I'm going to say this several times in this episode, but remember that your sidekick is a sidekick. They are there to support. They are there to highlight. They are there to shine a light on your main character. And this is going to be something that we're going to be kind of laying out later in the episode, which is that remember that your sidekick is a sidekick. They are there to give your protagonist a companion who provides emotional support, advice, practical help. Sometimes they're not offering that much help, but maybe accidentally, right? Because sometimes they are just there to enhance your main character's capabilities, making them more well-rounded or forcing them to be a hero or forcing them to see what some of their strengths might be, right? So this protagonist can be helpful or hurtful, but usually, they're there as a buddy, right? They contribute to a richer and more immersive story because they're expanding the cast of characters. They're allowing us to explore different personality types and also side stories and subplots that might happen with them. But again, remember, just because we have a side story doesn't mean we get lost on a whole other path. Another really fun things that often sidekicks can do is that they can provide some comic relief. They inject humor into your narrative. They provide these moments of levity that sometimes you don't have in a pretty tense and serious situation. This can be really fun, but again, remember the balance with this because, I have had too many younger, newer writers that are writing a story that's really serious, and then all of a sudden they have an interaction between their main character and the sidekick, and it's like this funny banter. And I'm like, dude, somebody just died. How are you having this funny banter? I understand you want some comic relief, but you have to be kind of careful in the way that you do that. So remember to maintain a sense of realism when it comes to these interactions, because the audience is dying to relate to these characters. They want to empathize. They want to have this connection to the story. They want to engage with the narrative. And sometimes a sidekick gives you this different entry point where your reader can do that. But if all of a sudden you disconnect from what reality would be, they're booted back out of the story, and they don't want that disconnection because that's what reading is about, right? Diving into something. Many times, the sidekick is really useful because through their actions or through the decisions or the relationships, they can actually play this crucial role in advancing the plot. They add complexity and layers to the story. But remember that, again, too many of my newer writers tell me, actually, you know what? My sidekick's actually the main character. No, that's problematic. Your sidekick, and I know that this sounds like, oh, wow, you just ripped all this creativity away from me. Why can't that happen? We're going to talk a little bit about this later. But really, for now, please do me the favor of thinking about your sidekick as somebody who actually enhances your main character. Your protagonist is a protagonist, and this is just the strict definition of protagonist, is that they are actually doing the actions that impact the plot. Not your sidekick. Your sidekick may contribute, but they are not the main character, and you really need to remember to keep it that way. Unless you're trying to write a whole new structure of story, good on you. but it's not going to be easy to do without maybe disappointing or surprising your reader in a not so great way. So remember that a well-crafted sidekick is enhancing your storytelling by contributing to character development for your main character. They're offering these various narrative advantages, right? They become an integral part of your protagonist's story. So this is just a way of enriching the story, coming at it from different angles and giving it more layers, but not taking away. So important. Remember that your main character, as I said, your protagonist and your sidekick, these are two distinct roles in a story. Each one serves a very distinct and different purpose. So your main character, this is your central character. The narrative revolves around them. They are the ones who are facing the primary challenges, conflicts, and obstacles that drive the plot. Their growth, their development, their journey are typically the focus of the story. They're the ones that readers or viewers are going to be identifying with. They're the ones whose perspective we are really embracing, right? Whereas the sidekick typically, traditionally, is a secondary character, right? Not a main character. They accompany, they support, they assist, they provide companionship, they contrast. They may have unique skills, qualities, perspectives, but these complement the main character's attributes, right? While important, the sidekick storyline is usually intertwined with and supportive of the main character's journey, not at all completely independent and becoming a focus. So remember that. The main character is the central figure that drives the narrative, and the sidekick is a supporting role. That's pretty important to realize because, again, if you're confusing the reader by having a sidekick that becomes the main character, we're talking about a whole other genre here. We're talking about experimental fiction. And for most of us, especially just trying out, starting out, trying out, trying to write our first couple books, maybe stick to something that is more marketable. Because the minute you start to surprise your reader in a way that is not welcome, now you could have a plot twist where we see some sidekick, but I want you to think about the balance of how long the reader thinks that this sidekick is just a sidekick to when they realize that maybe they were the protagonist all along. You have to be really serious about how you construct this sort of story. So let's talk about first, though, some of the archetypes of sidekicks, because many times some of my younger writers will be like, oh, okay, sidekick. Well, this is a buddy for my character. And, there's just like this one type of sidekick. But there are so many different types, so many archetypes that you can choose from, and you can kind of mix and match, and you can kind of create your own, and you can deepen some of these archetypes. They don't have to feel so rigid, but you've got some main character, categories. So you've got the loyal companion, right? This is the one who stands by the protagonist's side through thick and thin. They're providing emotional support. They're providing friendship, right? Think of Samwise from Lord of the Rings, right? This is a great emotional support, loyal companion sidekick. You also have the comic relief sidekick. This is the one who's adding humor to the story. They're either witty or ridiculous. They introduce some comic relief to tough, intense moments. They can lighten the mood. But as I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, be careful that this is kind of believable in the world of your novel. Yes, you have some characters who are cracking little jokes and stuff, even in tough situations, but you have to be really careful how you play this one. So if you look at Ron Weasley from Harry Potter, he would be a good example of a comic relief sidekick. Not too over the top, but just, kind of cool. Now you've got the mentor sidekick, right? This mentor may feel like less of a sidekick because you're thinking friend sidekicks, but sometimes you have a mentor who guides, advises, and shares wisdom and experience with the protagonist. Think of Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars. This could be a little bit of a mentor sidekick, right? And then, of course, you've got the foil sidekick. Many of you know what a foil is. A foil is a character that really contrasts with the protagonist. They're the ones who are highlighting these different traits. They're balancing their strengths and weaknesses. The perfect example of this is Dr. Watson, who balances out Sherlock Holmes, right? Dr. Watson is very illogical, but also allows Sherlock Holmes to show off his brilliance. You also have maybe the younger sidekick. This can be a younger character, a sibling, a babysitting charge, a camper that you have in summer camp. These are kind of fun because they can be innocent, but they can also be wise. They can be learning a little bit from your character, but also they have a little bit of this naivete where they've not been spoiled yet by the world. So you've got quite a few examples of this type of kid. In the Batman comics, maybe Robin is a little bit of these, but Robin does grow up and kids grow up. So this reminds you a little bit, though, that sidekicks are dynamic. You need to have a sidekick that is learning, growing, changing over the whole course of your story, and that's really important. You also have sidekicks that can be a little bit of a romantic interest, right? So this is interesting. And I'm not talking about romance novels, because romance novels, the two characters, the two love interests are two main characters, often kind of a protagonist and an antagonist, weirdly enough. But in a non-romance novel, you can have a romantic interest and supportive companion. They are involved in the protagonist's personal growth. They might force them to grow and improve, things like that, as a love interest, which can fade in and out, right? You can have a friendship that turns romantic and then goes back to friendship. Like, all of these things can change, but you can definitely have a sidekick who's a little bit of a love interest. And also you can have that anti-hero sidekick. I was talking about romance where the other love interest is a little bit of a antagonist in a weird way, right? Well, some sidekicks can be a little darker. They can be a little bit morally ambiguous, right? They challenge the ideals that your protagonist may have. They can help sometimes and they can hinder sometimes. So I'm thinking characters like Loki, right, in Thor, or Gollum in Lord of the Rings. These sorts of characters where they help and hinder, right? They have you thinking about what's going on, and they really kind of create and define the system of morality a little bit in your book, which is kind of interesting. And remember, these archetypes can absolutely overlap. Writers do this all the time where they blend the characteristics to create sidekick characters that are really nuanced, right? So think about your story's tone. Think about the themes. Think about what is important for you to show through this sidekick about the protagonist's journey, and you can absolutely model your sidekick after that. So I've been saying sidekick, 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 singular word, right? And a lot of my writers have a bunch of sidekicks. They have a group of friends for their character. Now, later on, we're going to be talking about my case that I make for isolating your character a little bit. And there's some very successful books that have a jolly band of characters. They have numerous sidekicks, right? So in many cases, it's really up to you how many sidekicks you have. There's no rule. And the decision can align with the needs of your plot and also your genre, the archetype of your story, all of those things. But let's talk about different types, right? You've got the solo sidekick, right? This is like the one important sidekick who's supporting your main character. And that's great because you can really delve into their personality, their conflicts, how they align, how they contrast, all of that good stuff, right? You can really dig deep into their personality and their growth and how their relationship changes and all of that. So that's kind of cool. You've got other types of narratives, especially sometimes with adventure or something like that, or like maybe a story that takes place in a school, for example, you'll have multiple sidekicks. Several characters, each one contributes to different aspects of the story, can represent various relationships and different angles of your main character. Now, this is something where I say, unless you're very skilled at presenting very different characters and really differentiating them, I say beware when you're writing a lot of sidekicks. Like, think of your cast of characters, and then I say, are you sure you cannot combine, reduce, kill some off before you start? Because it can be pretty hard when you have an ensemble cast with all these different, characters that are diverse, they're interconnected, they all have names. It can become a lot. And I know that it's really fun to write this. It's really fun to bounce from one character to the other. It's really fun to have your character being super popular, And I'm going to be talking about kind of our psychological desire to have more sidekicks. But I think this can be a little bit challenging. And finally, there's this common approach, which is to have a primary sidekick, and then maybe, another sidekick, like two sidekicks who have this close dynamic relationship, and maybe they form a triangle with the character, right? Maybe they are, there's extra conflict that happens. Maybe we're seeing different facets and they have their own relationship and then their own relationships with your main character. That can be very interesting too, but the relationship becomes kind of a character of its own in this case. And I think it's really important to ensure that each sidekick serves a really important purpose. Too many sidekicks without clear roles or significance definitely messes up your story. So strike that balance. If you're wondering, hey, do I have too many sidekicks? I can't tell. Who's going to tell me? Well, you've got this wonderful thing that Writing Coach offers called an editorial assessment. If you go on my website, you can apply to see if we are right to work with each other. I do a couple of these a month, and this is a really great economical way for me to guide you on what might potentially be problematic in your work, but also what's working really well so that you know if you're going in the right direction, right? Before you get a full editing job or a full, copy editing, line editing, developmental editing, you can have this editorial assessment and know if you're headed in the right direction. I think that this sometimes can be so worth it, and it's a great thing to do. Also, if you want to gift it to the writer in your life, definitely check out my website, and this is something that we can work out. Now, if you don't know if an editorial assessment is right for you, or maybe you're better off with a course like From Idea to Published in 6 months, or my DIY author program, you know what you can do if you've looked at the website and you just don't have enough information to know and make a decision? You can sign up for a call with me, your writing coach. It's free. And usually in my 15-minute calls with you, I try to solve a major problem that you have. And I will steer you to the right products for you. But if you're not going to end up buying anything from me or signing up for any work with me, that's fine. You still come away with a major issue that you might have had fixed. So give me a call. It's without any risk to you other than me kicking you in the pants and tell you've got a great story. Let's go, write it. So, okay, back to our sidekick discussion. We want to explore the nuances of relationships. And how do we do that, right? You need to make sure that each sidekick has their own personality traits, and they have their own motivations and their own goals, not just for themselves, but for the sidekick. That's really important because unlike people in real life where they're kind of, it depends, but a lot of people are every person for themselves. In your book, the sidekick very much exists in relation to your main character. And this is important for your narrative. This is one of those things where books and real life, two very different things, right? So with your sidekicks, you can use dialogue, for example, to highlight their distinct voice and quirks and how they relate to your main character. You want to add this authenticity. You want to consider how their strengths and weaknesses are really going to complement and or challenge your main character. This is so crucial for the balance of your story. And allowing the sidekick to undergo their own character arc, complete with challenges and growth, adds depth to their role, but also it ensures that even though they are very much a supportive figure, they're not just that, right? They have these moments where their unique skills are evident. So they do exist as their own person. Now, authors often have challenges when it comes to the right balance and to writing sidekick characters. There are some common mistakes that I have noticed, and these are some of the things that I look for. So if you've written a sidekick character, look at these things. Okay, how developed is your characterization? If you read your story, can you really see that your sidekick has a distinct personality? Can you see that their motivations are completely distinct and clear? Do they have a backstory? Now, I'm not talking info dumping, but I want you to be pretty clear on where they come from, what makes them tick, and why, right? Treating them as mere accessories instead of treating them like fully realized individuals is going to take away from your story, as is lack of agency. If you fail to grant your sidekick their own goals, their own challenges, their own character arc, if they are solely existing to serve your protagonist, well, they're not going to be very interesting, right? They need to be able to exist a little bit on their own, even though they are supportive, right? So find balance. Another thing is we talked about these different paradigms or these different archetypes of sidekicks, but if you are overly relying on stereotypes, you're falling back on these cliched sidekick archetypes without adding in the unique traits. If you've been lazy about that, you've been relying on these tired tropes, you need to refresh those, right? You can't just have the same sidekick that everybody's seen 20 times. Another massive thing that I see is that writers will write a sidekick just because they want their character to have a friend, right? And then as the story shifts and as the protagonist changes and their goals change and all this stuff, all of a sudden the sidekick's role shifts, but it's kind of inconsistent to their personality that they had at the beginning, right? So they didn't have this clear purpose at the beginning. So they start to waffle and they become all things to all people. And that's not really great. You cannot neglect to develop meaningful relationships between your sidekick and other characters. You cannot forget to explore that impact that the sidekick has on the overall story. And you can't have that impact shifting and being all these different things all the time. Yes, your sidekick is going to grow, right? They have to grow and evolve and learn. You cannot have them static and unchanging, but you can't have them flip-flopping either. Really important. And remember, I talked about that comic relief, that can be kind of fun, but you can't rely too heavily on your sidekick for humor without considering the other things that they do. They can't be that one-dimensional, that they're just the funny guy. And also they can't be inappropriate in infusing this comic relief in places where you're like, wow, that was a little abrupt, right? So remember that all of these can be huge mistakes, as can making the mistake of thinking that your sidekick is kind of the main character in real life, right? Now, I've seen a few stories where the sidekick slowly evolves into the main character. And I've seen this more maybe in series or in like a really long book where the sidekick can have this really compelling backstory and they've got this interesting perspective, right? So little by little, maybe over a series or maybe in a long story, as I said, that sidekick evolves into the main character. But I've got to say, be really, really careful because this challenges traditional storytelling conventions. Now, you might think that's super cool, but it also means that readers, agents, publishers, whatever, they're like, ooh, I don't know what to do about this because it doesn't fit into normal genres of storytelling. So it might impact your overall commercial success, right? So how do you tell if a sidekick becomes too important? How do you tell when they're in danger of taking over? Right? So if there's a shift in focus, if the narrative starts to predominantly revolve around the sidekick's story, overshadowing the main character's journey, some writers see this and they kind of ignore it because they're like, how am I going to fix this? This is something that you want to start to see sooner rather than later. Again, it's editorial assessment time because that's something you need to know because it needs to be fixed. Now, what if the main character's significance starts to diminish because their growth and challenges start to take a back seat? Well, I think that that's really painful because readers attach themselves to the main character. If the reader is starting to attach themselves more to the sidekick than to the main character, I think that can be dangerous for your story, because this means that the expectations of your reader have been subverted, maybe not in a good way. Your narrative might be losing its balance. It becomes skewed. The overall dynamics are changing, right? The balance between the characters are changing. The original plot is overshadowed by this new sidekick storyline. And ultimately, I think that generally this leads to a lack of coherence. Really, this starts to sound like two different books. Right? And many times when you don't work from an outline, when you're a pantser, this sort of thing can happen, right? Unplanned dominance, where the sidekick's role starts expanding unintentionally. They start dictating the plot. And as the writer, you might be like, wow, fun. Look at my little rebel characters. Look what they're doing. This is so fun. Tee hee hee. Okay, newsflash. Your reader doesn't find it as fun as you do. Okay, so be really careful in terms of that narrative arc and the, supporting storylines and supporting characters. Make sure they support. Now, I think that sometimes younger writers, newer writers, sometimes over depend on sidekicks. I often tell my young writers, your character has too many friends. This is a problem. And they fight me on it. But little by little, they start to realize that I might have a point, right? Why is it that younger writers specifically want to overdepend on sidekicks for their main characters? Well, there's several reasons for this. Most of them psychological. The first one is relatability and comfort. You might find it really comfortable to have this character who's got these supportive, close relationships. How nice for them, right? That mirrors your own desire for companionship. Maybe you're a writer who's a little bit awkward, a little bit solitary. You don't have, you're an introvert, but you want your character to be popular. I get you, right? I get that. You don't want them to be a dork. And you might want to feel unsure about how you're going to create a compelling narrative without using a sidekick as a crutch to fill in these potential storytelling gaps. You don't want your character to be alone because you think, is this going to be compelling enough? Let me tell you. If you dig down deep into the emotions of your character, it can absolutely be enough. I like the challenges that other characters bring in, but you can have an antagonist that's absolutely not a sidekick and that creates enough of the narrative pressure to power a whole story without depending so much on a sidekick. So you really don't necessarily need that. And make sure you're not using your sidekick as a crutch. That's really important. So any gaps in your storytelling, think about cause and effect. Think about emotional resonance. That's going to be much more important than buddy scenes, right? Another reason that younger writers, or any writers really, put in a bunch of supporting characters is they want this dialogue. And dialogue is great, right? I think that dialogue can be so engaging. It conveys information. It conveys all these facts and, feelings about characters, right? But sidekicks who are just conversation partners, I see that the conversation starts to take over. Again, we're talking balance. And when you have too much dialogue, your story's too dialogue heavy because you have so many sidekicks that are talking to your character all the time, that can be a problem, right? Another thing is that many young writers who are reading a lot of fantasy or adventure, they see a lot of main characters who are accompanied by a merry band of people. And they try to emulate these patterns without fully exploring the potential of their own story or their own main character. They're just like, you know what? Lord of the Rings has a ton of characters, or the Marvel Universe has a ton of characters, or Harry Potter has a lot of characters. I'm going to write this. There are other ways to go. You can do that. That's not a problem. But don't use your fear of loneliness and your just kind of going with what you've read to force you to have too many sidekicks, right? Never underestimate the fact that your solo character arc can be really, really powerful. There is such a thing as internal conflict. There is such a thing as personal growth, and all of that can really work. So I would say that if you're a young writer and you've had a tendency to write a lot of characters and a lot of sidekicks, explore a different narrative structure, right? One that has less characters in it, challenge yourself to try to see if you can write a character who can carry the story independently. That would be really interesting because it's going to definitely stretch your abilities and it's going to really challenge your writing skills and your craft is going to improve. So that's really important. So think about the different opportunities that you can have, right? Having a sidekick, the pros are the dynamic interactions, the dialogue, the character development, the emotional support, the contrast, the humor, and all of that. The cons are the risk of overshadowing the main character, balancing multiple character arcs, and just kind of the distraction of muddying the plot, right? In terms of isolation, I think the pros of that is that it really focuses intensely on the main character's internal struggles. You really dive into this main character and you are emphasizing the character's strength, their independence, their challenges, and their growth without them depending on anyone else as a crutch. They are forced to do it on their own, and that's really admirable. However, then of course, the cons of the solitude are, where is the dialogue, right? And then maybe the narrative is less dynamic because it's more introspective. You don't have two characters bouncing off of each other, et cetera, et cetera. But really, when you're trying to think, do I want more isolation or do I need a sidekick? Think about the story's goals. Think about the desired character development. Consider your personal, unique narrative, your plot, your themes, and start to think objectively before you get too deep into this whole thing. Think about, okay, how am I going to play this, right? What's best for my story? Now remember, even if you have a sidekick, I highly recommend increasing the isolation of your character, your main character, because I think that this really helps in their growth. So how do you do that? Even when they have a sidekick, right? So you can have the physical solitude, maybe remove their sidekick from them for a minute, right? If you give them a remote setting, limited access, they're physically separated from society and from their sidekick for a minute, that's going to be a unique challenge for them and is really going to help. Now, you've got some characters who have some sidekicks around them. Well, they can still struggle with forming emotional connections to anybody, including their sidekick, right? Maybe they have past traumas. Maybe they have experiences that make them hesitant to build relationships and that create this emotional distance. That can be really interesting to create that solitude. Social alienation. Maybe they're, an outsider. Maybe they're an introvert and they're misunderstood. They're ostracized. Any of those things. They may have a sidekick, but maybe it's not the sidekick they wanted. So they still feel very alone. And of course, you've got communication barriers, like maybe, their language skills aren't so good, or maybe they're, maybe they can't speak, or maybe they can't see, things like that. So think about these types of isolation, including symbolic isolation, where, these different things, even though, how you're in the middle of a room with a ton of people, but you still feel really alone, you can have your character feeling that way, especially if it's aligning with the character development and the themes of your story, and if it serves your overall plot. And that is the main thing, right? Think about your sidekick. They are serving your character. They are serving your plot. And I think there's so many fun things you can do with these characters, and I kind of love it many times. Now, I talked about your sidekick, how they can't become your main character. That doesn't mean they can't become a favorite character for your reader. Doesn't mean they can't become an iconic character, a super loved character. Make your sidekick shine and be lovable and unique, but remember what purpose they serve at the same time. I hope this helped. I think that this exploration of what a sidekick is and isn't is something that is great to remind ourselves of, whether we are a new writer or a little bit more experienced. Any of us can look back at our writing and think, you know what? I think I can do a little bit more with my sidekicks and my supporting characters. And so I encourage you to look at what you've done and feel free to reach out to me, your writing coach. We can have a chat or we can work together to take your story further than you thought it would go, faster than you thought it would. And I look forward to being with you next time on the How to Be an Author podcast. If you have any pressing writing-related questions or would like to be featured on the How to Be an Author podcast, please feel free to reach out on my website, creativeandwritingcoach.com.